Thanks for having me. My name is Pradel. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Media Silo. And for those of you who are not familiar with Media Silo, we're essentially a content management, collaboration, and secure file sharing platform. We've been around for the better part of a decade, and throughout the last 7 or 8 years, we've worked with many companies in the media and entertainment space, from small production companies to large media networks. And we've had a chance to really look at how many media companies, brands, post houses are really struggling with the subject of security. So, and I promise I'm going to make security as exciting as and engaging as I can. But I was kind of struggling to pull this together all within a theme. And then my wife roped me into the reboot of the XFiles. And I'm not an XFile myself by any means. But the general theme of paranoia, and of course the pithy, resonated with me, and the pithy catchphrases started to worm their way into my subconscious, and then it clicked, and I knew that I can wrap this up into a nice X-Files theme. So I promise I'm going to talk about cloud security. I promise I'm going to shed some light on new ways in which we can look at security that I think are unconventional and are moving us a step forward. But before I start talking about security and technology, I want to take a step back and talk about people, because that's really what at the end of the day, who's interacting with our content. So we fundamentally want to believe in the innate goodness of people, right? We want to believe that consumers value our content and they're willing to pay for the content, provided that we're giving them access and an easy way to consume that content. But we know that's not always the case, as evidenced most recently by Kanye West's album release that was downloaded millions of times on torrent sites. And the fact that torrent sites are just not going away is also a strong indicator that consumers are only willing to engage in our paywall so far. Perhaps more interestingly, though, we want to believe that our colleagues and our peers in the industry are also caring about security, and that they're doing everything they can to protect the content that we're creating, because after all, we're all in this content creation game together, right? And that isn't necessarily the case either, as evidenced by the fact that we have on-set stills leaking on The Walking Dead. Nearly all award screeners have shown up on torrent sites before their release. So this is a problem that's not going away. And it's a big problem because a recent study found that screeners that leak prior to theatrical release actually have an impact to the bottom line of the box office revenue by as much as 20%. So it's a big issue. I would contend, however, that this is not necessarily an issue and a flaw with human nature itself, but there's certain trends that are driving this in the industry. For one, we're seeing an explosion in content production. And whenever I talk to media executives and professionals, I feel like that's stating the obvious. But just between 2009 and 2016, 2015, our series orders for scripted television went up from 209 to 412. That's a phenomenal explosion in content. And we're producing all of this content at a greater pace without adding the proportionate amount of people to actually do this, which means that our staff is strapped for time and strapped for resources and under pressure to create all this additional content. This also means that we're employing more freelancers in the industry, and freelancers tend to be outside of the sphere of our influence, or the immediate sphere of our influence. So that's exacerbating the problem as well. And finally, content flows through more systems today than ever before, from on-set dailies to digital asset management systems to collaboration platforms to large file transfer systems. Content just has a lot more systems to travel through, and if any of those systems isn't as secure as we'd like it to be, we have a potential leak here. So as a result, we've been conditioned to really trust no one, and that's unfortunate. We've come up with a lot of well-intentioned rules and procedures and technologies, and those procedures and technologies are actually making our content less secure and not more secure. And to understand why, let's take a look at the types of people that are involved in creating and funneling this content through the supply chain. And this is where my X-Files comes back. So we've got our Scullies, otherwise known as the content operations, security, and IT people. And it's their job to essentially be skeptics of any technology that comes to them. They have to vet what is to be used on the production side. They'll pull it apart. They'll determine what use cases might present potential vulnerabilities. But they don't usually ultimately determine how a technology gets used. We see that the content protection folks usually just inform the line of business, and they have to decide what to use. On the other hand, we've got the molders, and those are the creatives. They are the ones that are interested in creating innovative out there work. They're the ones that want to bypass as much bureaucracy as possible, and their jobs are really getting harder and more frantic. And they're also willing to cut corners if need be in order to make deadlines happen. And then finally, we've got the key stakeholders, also called executives. And I'm going to refer to them as the monsters of the week, because we pretty much don't know which one of them we're dealing with at any given time, and they can be monsters. They know that security is paramount, and they profess to hold it as company value, but they're just as likely as anybody else to try to take a shortcut or request a shortcut that makes their lives faster. So I'm not saying that anybody in this room has ever requested, content without a password, but I would venture against and say that you've at least been tempted to when you were traveling on the road and were somewhat limited. So what's the problem here? The problem is that too often security and processes are created from the top down, without regard to how actual workflows, teams, and most importantly, people actually work. So if one Scully has to manage many molders, we can imagine that at some point that chain of command breaks down. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of companies today. You can have the best security policy, you can work with a Fort Knox of vendors, but if by doing so you're adding either time or cost or pain to the process of creating or sharing content, what you're ultimately doing is creating friction, and friction is really the enemy of security, right? We know that whenever something is difficult, people will find a way around that, and they're going to use unvetted tools, or they're going to get outside of the boundaries that we've set. So luckily, there is a way to get around this, and as I mentioned earlier, we've worked with a lot of companies, and we've sort of distilled from the 100 or so engagements that we've had on a specific security level what makes a security policy successful. And it's not as obvious as you may think, and in many ways it's a lot more obvious than you may think. So I'll drop it on you now. If we think of security not as a means of protecting content, but if we think about security from a perspective about empowering people, something very important is happening. I'm going to hazard that most of us in the room that deal with security address security through a combination of technology and process, whereas I think we should really look at security from a perspective of culture. So before we choose a technology that's right for the job, we need to create a very clear and transparent and flexible security policy that flawed people, flawed human beings actually feel compelled to use. So I can sum that up in 3 words that I think work for any size company, and that is trust but verify. So what do I mean by trust but verify? The number one most security measure that we've seen our clients use is radical rethinking of responsibilities. And I'll give you specific examples. We've done about 100 deployments with customers. We have about 550 customers. We have 100,000 monthly active users. And we get roped into security discussions all the time, if only for sharing best practices on how to roll out a big media management system. In this particular case, we had a very large customer that has thousands of active daily users. And they started just like anybody would start, by rolling out a system that was top to bottom, and that was created by one Scully, or by a run everything by Scully type of mindset. So you had one administrator, you had different people interacting with the system, and at some point it would break down because the sheer number of people got so large that the one Scully couldn't manage the thousands of molders. So what happened was it took days for user accounts to be created. It took days for proper content to be made accessible to key stakeholders. And worst of all, when there was staff turnover, people would still be in the system, or if they were removed immediately, their projects were orphaned. So those are pretty common problems. What they did, and what we see a lot of our customers do, is they move from a centralized system to a very decentralized system, okay? And it's pretty easy to see here that this Model A can only take you so far, because as the number of stakeholders rises, it becomes more difficult to manage them. But in a decentralized model, we call this the delegation of responsibility model. You're actually able to create a very organic security paradigm that works and grows with the company culture. This is not a thing that you can do overnight. This is not the kind of thing where you sit in a boardroom and decide, yes, this is the kind of company culture that we want to have around security. This is hard work. So the question is, how do you create and codify this kind of culture where you trust your people to successfully shift some of the security burden from the molders onto the molders of the world? So we do this in two ways. The first way that we use here is defining the circle of trust. And this is as simple as assigning project managers that have their own fiefdoms, their own areas of control where they create projects, they own the projects, and they own anything that has to do with the projects. And I promise we're going from the conceptual to the practical in just a second, but bear with me. So as we have a project manager must be able to be autonomous within that project, meaning they must be able to invite users, assign them proper privileges and permissions, must also be able to remove users, upload media, and manage the media in that project. If you do this properly, then you can enable that person to propagate this and allow them to assign project managers on their own, so forth and so forth. So once you have this and you have agility in assigning permissions and you're varying these permissions by project, you get the beginnings of a culture of this delegation of responsibility. It's uncomfortable to trust people, though, and I'm not talking about blind trust. I'm talking about using measures in unison with this that make sure that trust is well placed. So the second thing that we're implementing here is in Trust But Verify is verifying that our users are doing the right thing. We do this by logging and analyzing content. So anything a user does within a system leaves a trace. You upload a file, you download a file, you play a file, you skip to a file, you forward a file, you create a user. All of this creates traces in the system in of itself. And what's really important is that this is exposed to all users in the system so that we're not operating in a vacuum. So if I invite 10 users to my project, they need to see that we're tracking everything that's happening. And that becomes really important because it's a measure of accountability. So let's say we're on board as a company with this notion of delegation of responsibility. Now comes the time to select the technology to enact these policies. And this is difficult because technology doesn't necessarily enable us to do these things unless it's chosen very carefully. There's a trope in technology called the security triangle, and you've probably seen this with many different labels. The ones that I'm using are security, usability, and cost. And what the security triangle says is that usability and security are antagonistic in system design. That means that you can never have all three. You can have two, but never all three. And this is very, very true. Consider for a moment that we're flattening this triangle. And we're putting this triangle on a continuum where on the one hand we have a complete lockdown of all content, and on the other side of the extreme we have anything's available to anyone. Any security, any technology and any security measure that we put into place falls somewhere on this continuum, right? It's really all about what kind of compromise we're willing to make that affects our users in the system at large. And what that means is that every technology has its trade-offs. We have a couple of here that are examples. You may be using multi-factor authentication where you have a little app on your phone, and it increases the password security, but it also requires an extra step in login. And maybe we're okay with that, and maybe that's just our company policy, but it doesn't come without a trade-off. Another example is digital rights management software for playback of video content. Now, all the DRM does is really handle the secure delivery of a decryption key, but what it means to the user is that they have to install a piece of software, and that's where DRM often falls apart. So there's a trade-off and a compromise here. And my favorite one, which unfortunately we really see everywhere, is the laptop lockdown, where you've got the Scullys of the world saying you're not having admin rights on your screen. And obviously, we're decreasing our exposure to malware, but we're also decreasing the productivity of the molders of the world because we're limiting their choice of tools and ultimately the creativity with which they need to work. There's additional examples here. I won't go into more detail. There's one type of technology that exemplifies this trade-off better than anything else, than any other technology, and I want to talk about that over the next 5 minutes or so, and that's watermarking. We all know what watermarking is. We've seen it before. It's a tool in our security tool belt that has been around probably as long as nonlinear editing systems have been around or before. And what it is just embedding a piece of information into a video stream, and that essentially means that a user is accountable for the media because it may have their name on it or an ID. But if we look at the various technologies that exist today for watermarking content and apply this to our security triangle, we'll see that none of the existing technologies out there are really providing us with the 3 items on our triangle either. So let's go into them real quick to get on the same page. We've got forensic watermarking, which is probably one of the most common ways to watermark content. It's invisible. It gets embedded on the video baseband. And the fantastic thing about it is that it's invisible to the user. So it makes it very usable. And it later has to be decoded. We extract those little bits of information, look it up in a database, and then we know who this was issued for. So it's a system that works really well, but mostly we see it in distribution and not in everyday workflows. We don't see it when I'm sending you a review cut. We don't see it as we're sending a piece of content to be dubbed or for an executive to view something. And the reason for that is it's simply too expensive to do that today. It really is not a technology that scales very well, and even if it did from a pricing perspective, we've got some issues here that could make it cost prohibitive. The second form of watermarking that we see is called visual, or also called destructive watermarking. And that's been around since the first NLE, because all it does is it puts a name on a video, it creates a unique video stream, and now we have somebody's name that travels with the file. We also don't see that often enough, and the reason for that is, well, if you have a 90-minute feature film and you're trying to watermark that and send that to somebody, it'll take you 60 minutes, 40 to 60 minutes to encode that. And that's the trade-off of this technology. It works great if only we could have a watermark on every single file that was sent out. It's not possible under our current paradigm of toolset. I won't spend much time on overlay watermarking because it's the least secure. It's still often used. It's where the player simply transposes user information on the video itself. Unfortunately, it doesn't change the underlying video. So with a little bit of wizardry and browser hackery, you can get to the stream, steal it, and off you go. But it's highly scalable because it really doesn't alter the stream. And finally is DRM. I threw DRM in here because it comes up in our conversations anyway as a very effective means of protecting content. And again, all it does is it governs the secure delivery of a decryption key to a player that then can decrypt content and nothing else. And sometimes we also have watermarks that accompany this. The problem is the poor user experience. And the fact that they have to install software. So revisiting this year, forensic has great security, has great usability, but prohibitive cost and doesn't scale. We have visual watermarking, which has great security and usability, doesn't scale. We've got DRM, which is secure and cost effective, but usability is a question. And finally, overlay, which is just not secure. So all these options that exist have a major downside. The question is, how do we crack this problem? And this is where I want to tie the sort of conceptual conversation around the delegation of responsibility model and the technology discussion on the downside of the choices we make into sort of something a little bit more cohesive. And I want to talk about cloud computing. Most people, when I talk to them about cloud computing, because we're all educated now after 5 years of having AWS grow rampantly, about what cloud technology is and cloud computing is. Most people understand it as moving data from on-premise into the Amazon cloud or the Microsoft cloud. People understand that it's the difference between CapEx and OpEx, and that's all true. But really the biggest fundamental shift in what cloud technology does for us is it allows us to do things at massive scale. So if we apply massive scale and massive compute power to some of these security problems, we can actually achieve all 3 goals of our security triangle. And I want to show you an example of that. So Media Silo released a preview of a technology we're going to be showing at NAB called SafeStream. And SafeStream is essentially cloud-based watermarking in real time. So it's the best of both worlds. It's visual watermarking that burns a username into a video in real time, and that is available to the user without great delay. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples just to help you wrap your mind around what this really means in our daily workflows. I've got a file here, and I'm requesting the file, and within 9 seconds, this video has been watermarked for Agent Mulder, who can now view it on his desktop or on his mobile device. So that's pretty cool, right? I mean, it's a 3-minute clip, it's 9 seconds. It's pretty cool. Where it gets really cool is when we're working with a 12-minute file, and that 12-minute file is available from 12 to 18 seconds. And if we take that a step further, and we look at a file that's 30 minutes long, that file is available in less than 30 seconds. And finally, going back to our feature film, if we have a feature film that's 90 minutes long, that is available in 20 to 40 seconds. So if you have a technology that takes out the compromise and enables you to reach security, usability, and cost requirements, all of a sudden, this makes a lot of sense in your workflow. And I want to put this all together and show you how this works. And I want to preface this by saying that the SafeStream piece is very unique to what we do, but there's vendors in the company, in our industry that are doing a really good job at promoting the same notion of delegation of responsibilities. But I think there's few vendors that are putting this together as cohesively as we do. So this is a Media Silo standard interface. I'm a project manager and I'm logged on, and I want to show you how this this delegation of responsibilities and cloud-based technologies that extend that come together in one cohesive experience. I'm in a project here. The project manager clicks on the project. We have full visibility into who is on this project, how many users are on there. The other users can also see who's on there. There's a way to look at activity by project so that we have accountability. And this project manager can autonomously invite other users and assign permissions, right? And this is all a very simple interface. And finally, this project manager can open up SafeStream, apply a template, right, and move these items around and choose different data points. And from now on, anybody who's in the project and who's interacting with content in this project, here's 4 clips, receives a watermarked version of this clip. And it's watermarked on the video stream level and not just on the player level. So this is coming full circle. We have a system that promotes the delegation of responsibility, that treats all the stakeholders in the system with respect. We shift some of the responsibility around securing our content off to the molders and the creatives and the reviewers and the producers. And we're choosing a technology that extends this paradigm of delegation of responsibility by taking out the friction that so often causes security issues. So if there's anything I'd like you to take away from today's presentation, it's really to rethink security in light of creating a culture that promotes delegation of responsibilities and choosing technologies that implement that mindset. Thank you very much.
And do we have any questions for this? We're going to move your seat over here.
Is that a visible watermark, or are you talking about an invisible watermark?
It's a visible watermark.
Right, so you're overlaying something into the stream.
It's not overlaid into the stream. The actual video file at the source is modified.
Right, but it's burned in.
That's correct. It's burned in.
So you're going to gain the speed by doing the processing in the cloud.
Correct.
So does that mean the project needs to be in the cloud, or only when you move it to the cloud, or how does it fit into the people who are still working under the desk versus in the cloud, or the hybrids?
That's a great question. So SafeStream needs to be aware of the media, which means that even though SafeStream exists as an API and can be embedded into on-prem systems, we have an awareness API that essentially knows of a file, which means at some point you are transmitting that file into a safe container in the cloud where it can be prepped and delivered from. But what's happening under the hood is we take a file that's 90 minutes long, we split it into 1,500 segments, we send those segments to 1,500 machines that turn this around in near real time, and then bring it back to the user. And that's the benefit that we gain from the cloud.
Hi, is Excuse me, is there software that can leverage SafeStream in a way that unauthorized playouts would be, somehow it would call home and alert the content broadcaster or the content creator that a play was occurring that was unauthorized?
Great question. So SafeStream does not call back home. It does not have a way of alerting you when there's unauthorized playback. But if you consider the whole mindset behind it and the paradigm of delegation of responsibility, you're imparting accountability on your users because their names will be embedded in there. So even though you have no way of telling if somebody opened up the video on their desktop and they weren't supposed to, there's a chain of trust, and there was a person who had to leak their credentials in order to get that video released. So it's a different approach to it in order to maintain really good usability across the board. Because otherwise you would have proprietary players and you're changing how video plays back, and that would fall back under the umbrella of friction, and that's not the path we wanted to go down.